A very good evening, everyone, for today's Janavardhini webinar series. Topic for today, harm audit and DPIA under PDPA. For achieving an equal future, we at FDPPI celebrate the tremendous efforts of women and girls around the world in shaping a more equal future. Today on our panel, today on speakers for today are Shambhavi, Shyam and Shalini Varanasi. I'll briefly introduce our speakers for the day. Shambhavi is based out of London and a certified data privacy and GDPR professional. Shambhavi is also member of FDPPI with close to 8 years of industry experience, supporting in various capacities of human resource, learning and development, quality and compliance. Shambhavi is here with us today to share her inputs and views on DPIA under PDPA. Shalini Varanasi is a chartered accountant, even a member of FDPPI, with internal controls management and audit experience, currently pursuing data privacy. We welcome you today to this session. Both speakers, kindly put on your videos so that and your audios, and the stage is to you to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanyogita.
Yeah, over to you all.
Thank you, Sanyogita, for the introduction. And thank you, Navi sir, for giving me this opportunity to present part of the Gyanvardhini session today. Shambhavi and I will be sharing about harm audit and data protection impact assessment, along with one case study each. And in the end, we will have a Q&A session. To start with, I will be starting with harm audit under PDPB. I'm sorry, here. When we think about harm audit, we want to understand what are we protecting and from what. PDPB lays down protecting the interests and rights of data principles as an objective and lays down norms for protecting data principles from unauthorized and harmful processing. As a DPO of an organization, I will not be able to, just a moment, I need to admit somebody. So I was saying, as a data protection officer of an organization, I will not be able to protect the interests of data principles unless I understand the possible harms that they could be exposed to. And PDPB provides the needed clarity in this regard by providing definition of harm. PDPB identifies 10 harms for the definition. The list looks exhaustive. For example, it covers bodily injury, discriminatory treatment, loss of employment, restriction on speech, and surveillance not reasonably expected by a data principal. After providing clarity on possible harm, PDPB provides further guidance on identifying significant harms under Section 3, subsection 38 of Chapter 1, preliminary. This covers the harms that could have an aggravated effect on data principles based on the nature of personal data and the nature of harm. As a DPO, I will ensure that my team has good understanding of both these concepts, harm and significant harm. Determination of harm is inherent in all the obligation under PDPB. I believe these are the pillars on which the whole compliance for PDPB rests on. As a DPO, with good understanding of these concepts, my team will be able to advise the management on efficient ways of managing risk, which in turn would keep the cost of compliance in check. Most of the data fiduciary obligations under PDPB are determined on the basis of identified significant harm exposure. For example, PDPB requires informing the data principal on the likely significant harm exposure for processing of sensitive personal data. Even while designing privacy by design, exposure to data principals. I'm sorry, Ramesh, could you help me with admission of people?
We will
Shalini,
admission.
Sure.
Please ignore that. bell.
please ignore.
You-
I will take care. You please ignore.
Okay, okay,
You both go ahead. Yeah. Thank you.
okay. So I was saying that understanding the concept of harm and significant harm is important to assess risks to data principals. All the data protection laws around the world have an objective to protect the data principal interests and rights. To have an understanding of their interest, we need to understand the exposure to these harms. Now, moving on to the concept of harm audit. The word harm is mentioned 42 times in the bill. PDPB requires the determination of harm to identify the compliance and reporting requirements. The determination of harm finds mention in most of the important provisions, and we refer to this as harm audit. For example, in case of data breach, a data fiduciary is expected to determine the extent of harm and accordingly meet the reporting requirements. With regard to PDPB compliance, the data fiduciaries will first have to identify the extent of applicability of the provisions, which most of the times will depend on the determination of significant harm exposure to the data principals. For example, if Data Protection Authority is of the opinion that any processing by the data fiduciary carries a risk of significant harm, it may apply the obligations under the laws as if it is a significant data fiduciary. And for the determination of conflicting claims by data principals or between data principal and data fiduciaries, harm determination will be required to decide on PDPBA compliance response and to document and demonstrate the same in case decision is legally challenged by the aggrieved party in future. PDPB's objective is to protect the interests of data principal, and harm audit is the determining factor to assess how a company can comply with this requirement. As a data principal, if people may not understand the possibility of different harm exposure, but being in a fiduciary responsibility, data fiduciaries will have to ensure that they understand this concept well to ensure that they comply with the data protection laws as prescribed in PDPB. Moving on to another important area where harm audit is required for risk assessment is data protection impact assessment. Shambhavi will take over from here to explain the DPIA process in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Shalini. Good evening, everybody. So to begin about the data protection impact assessment, like Shalini said, harm audit is one of the essential part of DPIA. So when you say harm audit is an essential part of DPIA, what is DPIA? So let's first understand that. Now, under PDPB, section 27.
Shambhavi, make it full screen.
Sorry. It should be now.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. Thanks, Anand. Yeah, so to understand what DPIA is, under PDPB section 27, data protection impact assessment is a detailed description of the proposed processing operation, the purpose of processing, and the nature of personal data being processed. Assessment of the potential harm that may be caused to the data principals whose personal data is proposed to be processed, and also the measures of managing, minimizing, mitigating, or removing such risk of harm. Now, when I say that, DPIA is also a key tool to demonstrate compliance and achieve compliance for the organization. This helps the organization prove its compliance with the regulation, both to the authority and to the stakeholders. DPIA is also process-centric, meaning when we identify a business process, we assess the process for any kind of risk of harm, which is a result of implementing that process. So identification of the process, the risk attached to it, and mitigating it comes under data protection impact assessment. DPIA is prepared and conducted by internal team, and it is reviewed by the DPO. DPO further submits it to the authorities, and saying that organizations will be charged with penalties of up to penalties of 2% or rupees 5 crores if failure to conduct DPIA. Now let's move on to the understanding of the process of DPIA. Now DPIA is a planned structure. It's nothing ad hoc. So we will have a structured process to ensure that you can mitigate data protection risks. DPIAs are a useful way of ensuring the efficiency and also helping you in cost effectiveness to the security measures that you implement. So getting the DPIA planning and procedure right is very important. So let's look into the steps of how to go ahead with the process of DPIA. The first step is to identify the need of DPIA. Section 27(1) under PDPA mentions that where the significant data fiduciary intends to undertake any processing involving new technologies or large-scale profiling or use of sensitive personal data, such as genetic data or biometric data of the data principal, or any other processing which carries a risk to the data, risk or harm to the data principal, such processing shall not commence unless the data fiduciary has undertaken a data protection impact assessment. So examples of types of processing, when I say processing, a few examples to name are involvement of new technologies, new innovations, or denial of service, or having a large-scale profiling, making use of biometric and genetic data, things like that. The second step comes around is to describe the processing of personal data. So this talks about explaining exactly how and why you plan to use the personal data that you're processing. This description of the process will be useful as an evidence and also a justification for your decision whether or not to conduct a full DPIA within your organization. So your description should be outlined, recorded, and documented. And this should include the nature, the scope, the context, the purposes of the processing of personal data. Section 27(3)(a) talks about describing the process. DPIA shall contain a detailed description of the proposed processing operation, the purpose of processing, and the nature of personal data being processed. The next step to talk about is the consultation process. So when I say consultation, the meaning, the word itself tells us it's a process wherein you try and find the right set of people to discuss about the changes that you want to bring in or the process that you think about to carry forward. So consult with the relevant stakeholders. If you're using a data processor, then you may need to ask them for information and also for assistance. Think about who else are involved within the organization for this process to be implemented, and who would take the responsibility of the defined processes. Consultation process basically helps us to explain the DPIA better from the beginning stages to the stakeholders. It helps in gathering information and also suggests to help improve the planning and the assessment steps. This also helps us in monitoring the concerns related to privacy. The next step under DPIA process is the assessment of potential harm or risk. Section 27(3)(b) under PDPB says that assessment of the potential harm that may be caused to the data principals whose personal data is proposed to be processed. Consider the potential impact on individuals and any harm or damage you might cause while processing their personal data. So to assess whether the risk is a high risk or the risk is a low risk, you will have to consider both the likelihood and the severity of the possible harm. So likelihood and severity we'll see in the coming slides. Moving on to the further step, measures to control the risk of the harm. So once you understand the process, once you've consulted and spoken to people and assessed the potential harm, we look into what measures can be brought in order to mitigate the risk or the harm. So section 27(3)(c) under PDPB tells us that it should DPIA should contain measures for managing, minimizing, mitigating, or removing such risk or harm. Now, how do we achieve this? We bringing in controls and measures is what we think of to be documented. But in order to achieve that, all that we have to do is maintain a document, and against each risk that is identified, record the source of the risk. So you know what needs to be done from an early stage. You should then consider options for reducing that risk. DPO can be of help here in advising how to go about a DPIA, and also record whether the measure would reduce or eliminate the risk. Finally, helps this particular report would help us in understanding if the risk has been mitigated or there has to be extra treatment that has to be brought in. Now, the aim of this is to identify sufficient controls to eliminate each of the risks that is identified, or also to reduce them to a level which is acceptable to the organization. Few measures, depending on the risk scenario, can come under either deciding not to collect certain data which is not required for the processing, or also reducing the scope of processing, where it can help us mitigate the risk, or also in having a proper deletion of data process and retaining it for less periods, or bringing in technologies which do not require more than what is required to implement the process, things like that. The next step under DPIA process is reassess and review. So this includes steps wherein you think what are the other measures that you can bring in order to take the plan ahead. And it also helps us think if the proposed controls have been helpful in eliminating the risk, or has the organization brought it to a level where it is acceptable within the environment. And the overall level of residual risk is also mentioned after taking additional measures. When we review it again, if the review shows that the risks are not mitigated or the risk level is not changed even after bringing in controls, then we repeat the steps through consultation up till reassessing. Now, the last step under the process is the sign-off. So what happens in sign-off is, as part of the sign-off process, we should seek and document DPO's advice on whether the processing is compliant with the regulation and if it can go ahead. Once this is done, if there is any risk that has not been reduced to an acceptable level after implementation of the controls is identified, additional controls will need to be identified for the implementation of those identified risks. This must be integrated, and the outcomes of the DPIA into the project plans So there is a hand-in-hand scenario wherein the risks are identified as well as the control measures are in place to mitigate it. Once the DPIA is complete, it will be submitted to the authorities by the DPO, and it will be kept under review, and all the steps are repeated. Now to do this, I will showcase a sample template of how we maintain the DPIA register. Now this is again organization specific as per the convenience and as per the project that the organization is dealing with. You can come up with the elements of the register. So to begin with, you start with the risk description. So it talks about the process, the personal data asset, the risk scenario, and the risk owner. So when you say process, what is the process that is being carried out? It can be the collection or storage of data or retention of data, deletion of data, or sometimes transfer of data to another country outside India, etc. When I talk about personal data asset, I would make a note of all the systems, documents, applications, information of the data principle that is being processed. Risk scenario talks about the event in order to help us understand the potential harm in processing of the data. And risk owner is the person who is accountable and who is the point of contact, who is responsible in managing the risk and implementing the proposed risk controls, along with the team of support to design and implement the register. Next comes the risk analysis. So once we have described what the risk is about, who is the owner, who owns it, what is the scenario, we come into analyzing the risk in order to mitigate it. Risk analysis is a way of identifying and assessing factors that could affect the success of the project. It involves the calculation of the magnitude of potential consequences. This is referred to the impact, and the likelihood, that is the level of probability of these consequences to occur. So once you understand this likelihood, it is a qualitative assessment of the occurrence of the risk. So how often can the risk occur? If it is more than, if likelihood is higher, then it is higher the risk. Impact, for example. Impact tells us the depth of consequences or the effects of the risk. To what extent is the project being affected? The risk level talks about the level of the risk. That is, it talks about the level of the risk considering both likelihood and impact as factors. Higher the likelihood, higher the impact, higher is the risk. Existing controls are nothing but the controls, the set of measures that are already in place. This shows if the controls help in mitigating the risk and keeping the risk level low in the organization, or if the organization needs to bring in new measures in order to mitigate the identified risks. Moving on, we have risk treatment. So we have described the risk, we have analyzed the control measures, we have analyzed the level of risk. Now we think about what do we have to do in order to treat the identified risks. So we propose treatment actions, either the existing controls or newer ones to mitigate the risk, and we choose an option. And once the treatment of the risk is implied, we come back to the register and analyze the post-treatment status. So there we mention about the likelihood after the treatment of the risk, the impact after the treatment of the risk, and the final risk level after all the risks that is identified is treated. So I have the common matrix. It's a general matrix. So which shows the severity of impact and the likelihood of harm. So higher the risk, higher the impact and higher the likelihood, higher is the risk in the organization. Now moving on, let's look into an example which will give us an understanding of how to go about a DPIA register. This is a case where Mahoney Limited is managing a showroom in one of the prominent malls in Bangalore. It manufactures and sells clothes for men, women, and children through in-store and online shopping across the country. It provides cashback offers to its loyalty customers or frequent shoppers on the basis of their purchase made in-store or online, customer referrals, for example, etc. And this is done the cashback is done through payment accounts of the customers like Google Pay under direct benefit transfer scheme. So this gives us an understanding of the existing process in the organization that Mahoney Limited is following. What happens is the board received a business improvement suggestion from Asta, who is the general manager of Mahoney Limited, which has to be approved for implementation. So once we know that there is a new business improvement suggestion made, then we know that there are new technologies or new process that is being involved. To check on that, Asta's proposal talks about a face recognition program through the feed from security CCTV cameras at different places in the mall. Once you get the, once you get the face recognition program in from the CCTV feeds, match it with its loyalty customer pictures and recognize their customers present in the premises. The second process that she wants to bring in the change is to call out the names of the customers in the public address system and offer surprise rewards and invite them to the showroom to claim their rewards. She also proposes that she also mentions that the technology is being supplied by a third party in UK with a processing engine hosted on a hybrid cloud in London. So to analyze this particular case, I have to showcase this. It showcases the existing process of Mahoney Limited and also the new process that is proposed by Asta. So existing process talks about in-store and online shopping of the customers and the cashback offers through payment accounts that they have as a loyalty program benefit. The new process that is proposed talks about face recognition program for loyalty customers, calling out names on public address systems, and a technology to be supplied by a third party in UK. And the processing engine is again hosted outside India. So considering Mahoney Limited to be the significant data fiduciary, collection of data, which talks about the scope, purpose, context, and nature comes to play. Data transfer outside India because of the new technology that Asta is talking about, which will be supplied by a third party in UK. And once we talk about the collection of data and transfer of data, the consent from data principle becomes important. So to analyze this case, as per the DPIA process that I explained, the first thing that we need to do is identify the need for a DPIA. So according to the case, the proposal of new process as part of the business improvement strategy. So we have new technologies and new processes coming in. Collection of sensitive personal data for face recognition and public address system, calling out names. So you're collecting the personal data from the data principle, which also includes the sensitive personal data. So we definitely would want to go for a DPIA. Second step would be to describe the processing of personal data. So to describe the process, the purpose, the nature, the storage, the scope. So when we talk about the purpose, why is the organization wanting to collect data? It's obviously for the proposed plan of the face recognition, the loyalty program that she's talking about. Then if you come down to the nature of the processing, then collection of sensitive personal data is being done. Storage and data transfer includes third party outside India. So that is the nature of the process. Then the scope of the process. It talks about the location of data being processed. Is it India or is it happening in UK or on the cloud based in London? Frequency of usage of data. Now, every time the organization decides to reward their loyalty customers, or is this predefined as a package under the loyalty program for the customers? Next comes the sensitivity of data that is collected for processing. Images, live feeds from the CCTV cameras, children data might be included, and the mall visitors images who are not customers of Mahoney Limited, and also the payment account details through which the cashback payment is being made. So all these come under the sensitive data collected for processing. And then comes the context of the data, context of the processing. So how the organization collects the data from the loyalty customers during registration to the loyalty program and from the CCTV feeds. Then comes the contractual obligations with the customers and the parties involved. So in our case, the contractual obligation is between the customers and Mahoney Limited and the third party, and again Mahoney Limited and the mall owners or the CCTV owners. Then comes the mentioning to the data principals about their rights, which includes the consent to be taken, the withdrawal of consent if they're not interested to continue the loyalty program, how do they withdraw the consent, and all the other rights, and being transparent with them, of course. Then updating the privacy policy, keeping in mind all these points about the data principal rights and the contractual obligations and the purpose of the processing, the scope of data collection, how we collect data, why we collect data, everything comes to picture. The next is the consultation process. So consultation happen between the DPO, the stakeholders, the information security team, and the third party in UK who is processing the data. Assessment of potential harm or risk talks about the data collection without consent. This can be from the customers who are registered for the loyalty program. It can be the mall visitors who have nothing to do with the loyalty program, and the children data. Children do come into mall with the parents. And location of processing and storage of data. So because there is a third party involved here who is in UK, and also the cloud based in London, and Mahoney Limited is in India, we will have to make sure we are transparent in telling the customers when taking their consent of where the location of data is, who is processing it, how are they processing it, and where the storage happens. This will also help us in planning the security of the data. Loss of control over the use of personal data. This can happen with respect to unauthorized access by the third party. They can use the image of the customer or the CCTV feed for anything other than specified purpose. Then again, the contractual obligations, that can be a harm if it is not treated properly. So now that we know the potential harms, we have made an assessment of what the harm could be. We need to go into the measures, look into the measure to control the risk of the harm. So measures can be, few of them that I've come up with here is to minimize data collection wherever necessary. And then additional terms in contracts for clarity and security, control over authorized access, and deletion of data after purpose is served. So all this we will have to put that in a contract or the privacy policy, take measures to control the access and give authorization only to the key persons who are involved in this particular processing. So these are only a few that I've named here. Coming to reassessing and reviewing the process, check for the risk level, if it is high, medium, or has it come down to low, record the eliminated risks, and add in additional measures wherever required. The final process, sign off. DPO reviews the completed document with all the comments and recorded. It is then submitted to the authority and then kept under review. This is to showcase how it is done in the Excel format when we usually do it in organizations. So keeping the case as an example again, under risk description, if you're considering the processing of data, and the personal data asset will be the photograph and the CCTV live stream access. Risk scenario that I see here is that the third party processes data for unspecified purpose because they have access to it, and also the risk of unauthorized access. So the purpose for which it is being processed can be at risk, and also the images can be used by someone who is not authorized. Risk owner will be Mahoney Limited, and the treatment of action that can be proposed is encryption of data or changes in contractual clauses, or give authorization to only the key resources for this particular project. Based on that, the risk and harm assessment under PDPA, again, only a few to name. Under section 5, limitation on purpose of processing of personal data. This is in order to process data of customers collected for consented purpose only, and not anything other than the specified purpose, and only to the extent that is necessary. Under section 6, which talks about limitation on collection of personal data, collection of data to the extent that is necessary. Section 11 talks about consent necessary for processing of personal data. This again, if it is a sensitive personal data, then you'll have to collect an explicit consent from the data principal. So in this case, collection of personal data like name, contact information, email, image, CCTV feeds comes to picture. Section 16 talks about processing of personal data and sensitive personal data of children. So in this case, relevant to this case, collection of image through CCTV feed without prior consent from the parent or guardian. Section 24 talks about security safeguards. This comes into picture with the storage of data and the deletion of data by the third party. Section 33 and 34 talks about personal data transfer outside India. Because we have a third party who is based out of UK and in London, photograph of the individual, biometric templates, the CCTV live stream that is being shared with them for processing is like giving them access to the personal data and the sensitive personal data of data principle. So under the guidelines of personal data transfer outside India, we will have to take care that we are compliant with those regulations. This is about the case. So I think Shalini will take up the next case now to understand this better. Thank you.
Thank you, Shambhavi, for sharing the DPIA process in so much of detail. And I will take up another case to explain the process in more detail. Allow me a few minutes to read you the case study. I'm sharing it in two parts. Just a moment. As an existing process for the first part and the new process. In this case study, a company is selling all kinds of clothes for men, women, and children all across India in physical stores and online. To promote the sales, it manages a loyalty program where all purchases, both in the showroom and through the virtual orders, are tracked and cashbacks are credited directly to the financial accounts of the customers. Now, the company proposes to introduce a facility where a customer provides his or her full-length mobile photograph and clothing selected from the virtual store is displayed as worn by the virtual image of the customer. And it is to be introduced through existing mobile app to the registered customers only. The processing technology is to be supplied by a third party in UK with the processing engine hosted on a hybrid cloud in London. Like Shambhavi shared, a DPI has to contain the details of proposed process. I'm going to share the process for the new case study that we are considering. Capturing the process is very important to understand the introduction of new data inventory and the interaction of the new data with the existing personal data in the system. Like DPI has to contain the details of proposed process, this should also include the purpose of processing and category of personal data. Therefore, it is important to understand and document the process before starting the assessment of potential harms to the data principles. I'm continuing to use the word harm here because though DPIA is process-centric, the identification of risks remain data principle-centric. As we discussed earlier, it is important to know what are we protecting. The mapping of the process will give us clarity on the collection and creation points of new data inventory and would also throw light on the nature of personal data. The mapping would also help in understanding, like I mentioned earlier, the interaction of new data points with existing data inventory. The flow of data in the process should cover the collection and creation of data and the location of the same. For example, in this case study, we are collecting full-length mobile photograph and it is being uploaded by the customer, and a virtual image is being generated during the processing. The process should also cover the processing locations, whether it is in India or outside India, to keep in mind the important provisions about data transfer outside India as laid out in PDPB. The storage locations and the movement of data is important to understand to provide for appropriate security measures. And finally, the disposal trigger and the plan should be decided as well. In this case study, we are collecting full-length mobile photograph of the customer, and facial images of data principals is considered sensitive personal data as it is identified as biometric data. Although we are assuming that children are not part of the mobile application users, however, as the company is offering children clothing, the parent would try the virtual trial room for children as well. So we would be creating a category of data which is relating to children's data. It's important to identify this category because it has separate compliance requirement in PDPB, as while collecting children's data, the company needs to have explicit consent of parent or the guardian. Next step in the process of identifying the movement of data inventory in the system is where the data is captured and stored. In this particular case, I'll move on to the process map to explain it better. In this case study, the customer's data is there on customer device. They update their profile and trigger the processing when they want to try on a new clothing. And customer management system is the existing system within the organization already holding the inventory relating to customer's name, contact information, which could include email and phone numbers, profile pictures, which right now, before the new process is introduced, is optional. But when we introduce this new process, there will be image profile requirements for customers to use to try virtual trial rooms, and the loyalty points and financial details as the process involves direct benefit transfer. The existing system which holds data inventory is customer management system for the organization, and the data in control of the customer is on their mobile app. I have shown the virtual store separately, but it is part of the customer management system. However, it doesn't make any difference about the location of personal data. So I've shown it separately for convenience of understanding. Now, here is the most important introduction into the system, which is the third-party processor. I am assuming that before conducting this DPIA, we have not already rejected this proposal considering the necessity and proportionality of the case. We are assuming that we have given a chance to the proposal to understand in depth if the risks that are arising because of the new technology could be mitigated. So we are continuing with the DPIA. Although giving it a first look itself can make one feel that this could be avoided. I mean, the transfer of data outside India. So the new addition to the system is the third-party processor, which is located outside India. Cloud applications are considered as located outside India, depending on the server location. So we have assumed that whenever the data is transferred to this third party, it'll be assumed as transfer outside India. So the data that we will be sharing for the processing with a third party will be the full length photograph of the customer and the clothing image. The processing would involve superimposition of the clothing image over the full length photograph of the customer, which in turn will create another data point, which will be the superimposed image. Now, after understanding the creation of new data and the interaction with the existing data, I would like to highlight the exposure here. In the current customer management system, we are also holding the financial details of the customer, although there are more data points which are personal sensitive data. For example, the profile picture, if the customer is already holding it in the database, and the financial details. If we allow third party to access the customer management system to pick up the full length photograph, we are exposing the whole personal database to a risk of harm. Therefore, it becomes important to in-depth analyze the data points and the interaction with existing data inventory. I would also like to share that, I'm sorry. Let's move on to the next slide. I wanted to share that while identifying risks for DPIA, like I've mentioned earlier while discussing harm audit, although we are considering the harm to data principles, but PDPB identifies the principles and obligations which consider the reasonable expectations to provide security to data principles. So all the requirements are designed to ensure security to the data principle. For example, if I'm considering collection without consent as a risk to data principle, it is being identified as a risk if the data principle has not given their explicit consent for the sensitive data. That means they are not comfortable to provide their information for the new technology proposed. And if, for example, the company does not introduce proper controls to, I'll just go back to the previous slide to explain it better. If the company does not hold proper controls to protect information of profile pictures of customers, this processing without appropriate controls could lead to picking up of this profile picture I mean, it could happen in case of mistakes or errors in the system, but that exposure will remain. So while considering and identifying risks, we have to ensure that the obligations and rights as defined in PDPB are also considered. Next, risk as an example for this particular case is collection without consent for children's data. Now, if I am as a parent sharing my child's image for processing, I am giving a deemed consent, though the concept is not identified in PDPB, but it can be taken as a deemed consent for children's data. So I don't see much exposure here. And then collection without appropriate notice or processing without appropriate notice. If a data principal does not understand the exposure to harm as a data fiduciary and because of the fiduciary responsibility of the companies, they are under obligation under section to share the details of the process and the risks involved in the same. So a company cannot decide to go ahead with the process involving high risk, as the DPIA would also require attestation by the Data Protection Authority. If they find exposure to be high for data principals, they might also put the new process on hold. So all the data fiduciaries will have to consider all the risks and mitigate the same to continue with the process. Because like we have been sharing, every new technology requires a DPIA and which needs to be submitted with the Data Protection Authority for their approval. And in this particular case, data is being transferred outside India without explicit consent is another risk. So though the company can transfer data outside India under PDPP, but they have to maintain a copy in India and obtain explicit consent from the customers. Then there is another significant risk for the customers. Suppose they are sharing their picture and this company is selling all kinds of clothing. And if the superimposed images are also being stored by the company, it increases the exposure to the data because some images the customers may not like to keep in access of company. So the company will have to ensure that they have a system in place to either delete the data right after processing or highlight it to the customers that they will not be storing these images, though giving them an option that they could store it on their mobile devices. Therefore, for any new process, a company has to ensure that data handling is minimized, which will give the company a lot of leeway to understand and find better ways of providing that service. Though every company would want to introduce new technologies and increase their business. However, as PDPB compliance would require, the companies have to keep in mind the data privacy for individuals and protect their rights and interests. like I shared earlier, we, as data principals, individuals may not really understand the harm that could come their way. So the companies in their fiduciary capacity will have to take care of this obligation to understand and identify risks and follow the process as defined under PDPB to conduct a DPIA through and through to ensure data privacy for the individuals. Thank you so much for giving me time to explain this case study.